It brought an end to years of war in Liberia, and now it's wrapping up. The tenure of Nobel Prize-winning President Johnson Sirleaf is regarded by many Liberians as the best in the country's history. Others say she has not delivered on her promises to truly move the country forward. It still relies heavily on foreign aid, and the emancipation of women is still a problem. But her 12 years in office has ensured that these Liberians are free to choose whoever they want as the next president.
After this election, I'm looking for a leader that is transparent, a leader that will seek the interests of the people.
2.2 million Liberians were registered to vote for the new president. They chose among 20 candidates. 2 are independent and 18 belong to political parties. The candidate who wins 50% or more of the vote will be elected president. If no candidate wins 50%, there will be a runoff between the top 2 contenders. Such a runoff is shaping up between international football star George Weah and Vice President Joseph Boakai. But the most reassuring development for observers has been the lack of violence in the polling. It's the first time since 1943 that a smooth transfer of power will take place without international intervention. Liberia had been crippled by violence for years as rival militias fought each other. That was before Sirleaf was elected the first female African head of state. The vote was the start of Liberia's transformation.
Remember that you are an empowered people. The future of the country is in your hands. No one is entitled to your vote. Vote for the person and persons you believe will make Liberia a better place.
That person will determine whether that trend continues. Shoaib Hassan, the Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from London is Alex Vines, who heads the Africa program at Chatham House, and he's a former UN advisor on Liberia. And in Nairobi is Nanjala Nyabola. She's a writer and analyst with a focus on African politics. I thank you both for joining us. Nanjala, let me begin with you. So this could be the country's first democratic transition of power in more than 70 years. How important is this vote for the people of Liberia?
I think it's incredibly important. As you've mentioned, Liberia has been one of the most conflict-ridden countries, not just in Africa, but around the world. And I think it would be a huge symbolic victory for the people of the country, for them to see a successful democratic transition. We've seen in other countries that have had a similar past, in Nigeria, where you've had a lot of coup d'etat, a lot of military takeovers of the state. You've seen the same in Ghana, that having that first democratic transition really goes a long way towards consolidating political participation, towards consolidating belief in the republic, even, if you will. Both Nigeria and Ghana have benefited tremendously economically, politically, and socially just from having that peaceful handover of power, civilian handover of power. So I do think it's a really important event in Liberia.
Yeah, so before we talk about who would be best for the country, let's talk a little bit about Johnson Sirleaf's legacy. Alex Vines, has it been a good 12 years?
It's been a mixed 12 years, but it's true that Johnson Sirleaf has served 2 terms. She was elected first time and then re-elected. And the country has been peaceful. There hasn't been conflict. It got badly knocked back, as your listeners and viewers will know, with Ebola. But the country is at peace, and that is a tremendous credit to Johnson Sirleaf, that she has provided that stability over her 2 terms. In terms of economic growth, efforts against corruption, inequality, there's a much more mixed record. The reality is that Johnson Sirleaf is better regarded, she's more famous outside Liberia than she is in Liberia itself. And I think it was very telling that she has kept a very low profile in the run-up to this election that's just happened in Liberia, not even signalling which candidate she would prefer, for the simple reason that that might actually reduce support for a particular candidate.
Nanjala Nyabola, mixed legacy?
Absolutely mixed legacy. Like Alex just said, within Liberia, there was a lot of concerns about nepotism, a lot of concerns about corruption. She made a lot of really big promises when she ascended power, and the sense in Liberia for a lot of Liberians is that she didn't deliver on some of the major things that were hurting them. And corruption, as I said, is a big part of them. But, you know, appointing her sons to key government positions at a time when the country is still grappling with cleaning up the public service, even if her intentions were good, it doesn't look good, I think, for the general public. And especially on women's rights, I think being the first female president in Africa, there was a lot of expectations that she would do more for women's rights. There was a lot of expectations that she would be fighting a lot of key battles on FGM, on access to healthcare. Liberia has one of the worst statistics for access to healthcare, and that falls disproportionately on women. And the general sense is that she didn't actually deliver on those things.
Mm-hmm. Alex, Twitter seemed to have jumped the gun late last night. Well, not Twitter itself, but a lot of people on Twitter saying George Weah's got it, he's the next president. And then people dialed it back and said, well, it's not official, we don't quite know. Tell me, who would be the right candidate for the presidency? Who would you like to win?
Oh, look, that's a really tough question, and we don't know who's won. My working assumption is that there'll probably need to be a runoff, that George Weah definitely seems, from my informants in Liberia, is leading in certain parts of the country, but the former vice president is also leading in another part of the country, and the former warlord, also Prince Johnson, is leading in another part of the country. So we'll have to see on that. I mean, George Weah is obviously well known internationally because of his football career, and he's certainly attractive to Liberian youth, and so the youth vote might well have come out stronger for him. The issue about experience and technocratic ability, then you would have to say it's the vice president, the Johnson Sirleaf's vice president, who's now standing for president, Mr. Boakai. He would be the one that might bring more of the experience. Mm-hmm. I do have some concerns also that the wife of the former President Charles Taylor, Jewel Taylor, is the running mate of George Weah, and
right.
That raises a number of issues in my mind too.
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, everybody's focusing on his Ballon d'Or and football legacy. Not many people have mentioned that. Nanjala, George Weah, Prince Johnson, or Joseph Boakai, who's the right candidate to take that stability and translate it into prosperity?
I think it depends on how, on what priorities Liberians set for themselves moving forward. As Alex has said, George Weah does have that name brand recognition, and he does bring a measure of, you know, what you don't want to do is what exactly happened with Johnson Sirleaf, which is to have these tremendously high expectations that will be almost impossible to meet. And, you know, when you have someone like that who has that name brand recognition that George Weah has, who has been promising, I mean, he ran against Johnson Sirleaf before and has been promising the same massive changes that she promised and was unable to deliver on. There's always that risk that it will lead to frustration. And leading to frustration in a country with a history of conflict, you know, it raises the temperature of, and raises the prospect of perhaps not necessarily a generalized return to violence, but perhaps a localized return to violence, especially with a frustrated young population. If, on the other hand, your priorities are economic, then, well, maybe you have Boakai would be a better candidate, that this is a person who, you know, might be a safe pair of hands for the economy. Having said that, again, you know, Liberia is getting really hit really hard by the fall in global commodity prices, by the fall, you know, the lower interest in purchasing diamonds or purchasing, you know, timber from Liberia. And I think it would be whoever takes over is going to have a very big job ahead of them to stabilize the economy, to address some of the structural issues that Sirleaf has been unable to address in the 12 years that she's been president.
Yeah, and so we're still in this kind of election process. They have until October 25th to announce the winner. In the meantime, Alex, the Liberty Party candidate Charles Brumskeen has said there are irregularities. Now, the international observers, the ECOWAS observers, the AU observers have said things are relatively fine. They don't have any problems. Brumskeen saying, no, there are major problems and he wants a rerun. I mean, this might be sour grapes if there's no evidence. However, is there the possibility of chaos on the streets and instability on the streets if someone like Bromskeen says he doesn't recognize the results of the election, or is he too small of a player?
I think he's too small of a player, and the international observers, I mean, I have a colleague who's on one of the observer teams. They've been pretty impressed. The elections have been very impressive from what I'm hearing from Liberia, 2.1 million registered voters, and there have been some irregularities. One area I know has been sanitized at the moment because of irregularities, but the overall picture is a pretty positive one. So I tend to think we don't need to worry about that particular scenario. This is not the high drama that we're seeing in Kenya, for example, at the moment that's playing out.
Nanjala, yeah, you're smiling because you're in Kenya, and we've spoken about this before as well. I mean, many Kenyans I've spoken to recently have been embarrassed at how things have played out because Kenya is supposed to be, you know, a power on the continent. Does it warm your heart that in Liberia right now we're seeing an election play out freely and fairly?
It warms my heart, it really does. And I think it's really encouraging to see. I think democratic gains in West Africa in general have been tremendous in the last 5-10 years. And I think it's important to celebrate that. I think, just looking a little bit further west, looking at the Gambia and what we saw in December of this year, looking at Nigeria, looking at Ghana, there's been some significant, Burkina Faso, there's been some significant democratic gains in West Africa after a long period of uncertainty and a lot of political violence and a lot of instability. And for us in East Africa, we're seeing the opposite. We're seeing a lot of reversal of a lot of democratic gains, not just in Kenya, in Uganda, in Tanzania, shrinking space for civil society, a shrinking space for political participation. So while it warms my heart, I'm also a little bit jealous, to be honest, for them to be able to go to the polls so cleanly and have that belief and waiting on the system after such a long period of political turmoil. Yeah, I'm a little jealous.
Yeah, and as we kind of bring this all the way back to the beginning, Alex, you mentioned the context. This is a country that has been through a lot. The legacy of that civil war is a shadow that still hangs over so many people. And then, just when things were sort of getting stable, they were hit by Ebola. I mean, this country has experienced a lot. That was the context, and that's why you said, Alex, that one of the successes of President Sirleaf was just kind of keeping things together. But as things stand now in 2017, if I had to ask you, what do Liberians want? What would you say?
Inclusive growth. They want jobs and inclusive growth, and it's going to have to be the economy and inequality that is the focus. And particularly youth employment. The population is very youthful, and the next president is going to have to focus much more on those sorts of issues. That's what Ellen Johnson Sirleaf was not successful enough about.
I've got to move on. I thank you both for joining us on the Newsmakers.